So, without further ado, we are really thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Birgit Meyer, a professor of religious studies at the University of Utrecht. Professor Meyer's work has been powerfully influential, as I think we all know, in cultural anthropology and beyond. Her research is focused on colonial missionization and local inflections of Christianity, especially Pentecostalism, popular culture and media in Ghana and elsewhere, as well as exploring broader conceptual issues related to sort of multiplex historical and contemporary articulations of religion and connections and coexistences across religious diversities. Professor Meyer is the recipient of the Spinoza Prize from the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, the Academy Professor Prize by the Royal Dutch Academy of Arts and Sciences, and most recently, the Stuart Hoover Mentorship Award from the International Society of Media, Religion, and Culture. She is a prolific author, writing such books as Translating the Devil, Religion and Modernity Amongst the UA in Ghana, and editing new classics like Aesthetic Formations, Media, Religion, and the Senses, and Things, Religion and the Question of Materiality. Professor Meyer studies religion from a global and we might say post-secularist perspective, and crucially, her work attends to the material, bodily, and political aesthetic dimensions of religion. This is especially apparent in her ongoing research program at the University of Utrecht, Religious Matters in an Entangled World. She's been a leading voice in the material turn in the anthropology of religion, and we are beyond excited for her to open this conference, which in so many ways has been inspired by her wonderful research. So, thank you so much for being here. I will just share your slides.
Oh, yeah. And then I can just press it here.
Yes, exactly. There we
Yeah.
go.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this multidisciplinary conference organized by your Cambridge Interfaith program. I noticed that your program does not only conduct research on interfaith encounters, but also seeks to bring the insights gained to bear on interfaith encounters so as to improve them. And I think this is important in our conflict-ridden world in which religions play a key role, both in generating and also possibly resolving conflicts. The outline for this conference calls attention to the concomitant occurrence of the material turn in scholarship on religion on the one hand, and in recent incentives to facilitate interfaith encounters so as to move beyond the usual focus on dialogue on the other. What can we expect to gain when we, and I quote from your outline, when we examine materiality in the context of interfaith encounters? In other words, which difference does a material turn make for methods and concepts in the study of interfaith encounters, or more broadly, plural religious environments, and which new insights can be acquired? I will address this question, which will of course occupy us throughout this workshop, from my position as a scholar in the interface of religious studies, cultural anthropology, and African studies. This combination proves to be productive for me because my work in Ghana has again and again prompted me to question certain taken for granted Eurocentric ideas, such as the strong focus on bounded religious traditions and the neglect or even dismissal of the material dimension of religion. In our research program, Religious Matters in an Entangled World, which I have been able to set up at Utrecht University, we conduct research on religion in Europe and Africa from a material, corporeal, and relational angle. And it is against this backdrop that I wrote this lecture. And what I hope to do is, in a way, try to lay out for you why I find it important to take firstly plurality and secondly materiality as the default in research on religion in general and interreligious relations in particular. And thirdly, I will offer some examples of the multiple ways in which things matter for people in plural religious environments and how their study triggers new ideas for academic research. So first, plurality. Max Müller's much quoted dictum, "He who knows one religion knows none," is right. Religion comes in the plural, and this plurality should be the starting point for research on religion. Of course, there's nothing wrong with developing deep expertise in one religious tradition as such. What is problematic, however, is the scholarly compartmentalization of a plural religious field along religious lines, as has been the case in the study of religion in Africa, where distinct expertise on Islam, Christianity, or African traditional religion, ATR, has long been artificially separated, whereas they are all de facto deeply entangled. And as a consequence, a number of authors over the past decade, and I put up a little book table here for you, a virtual one. So it has been criticized that scholars have barely situated these religious traditions in relation to each other in the wider political, social, cultural, and religious environment. This shortcoming pertains not only to African studies, but to the study of religion in general. Researchers fail to pay due attention to the encounters between different religious traditions and concomitant processes of transfer in past and present times, as the editors of the journal Entangled Religions, which comes from open access from Bochum University, from Ceres, put it. The point here is that encounters and the ensuing relations are constitutive for how religious traditions develop and transform. Encounters occur in an interstice, or Zwischenraum, you would say in German, which is rife with challenges, opportunities, and tensions. And in my view, the prime unit of research on religion should be the interstice in which religious traditions coexist with each other. From this perspective, plurality forms an apt starting point. I want to stress that I do not understand plurality as the sum of neatly distinguishable entities which all belong to the species of religion. Just in preparing, I read a new book, very good, by Thomas Howard, The Faith of Others, in which he also makes this point, this critique of treating religions as different species. Of course, I'm critically aware of the construction of religion as a modern category under which various ways of relating to a beyond are distinguished, yielding an imposed and artificial formal similarity of these various ways, which subsequently serves as the basis for their difference. Much could be said, of course, about the problem of defining religion, but I do not want to rehearse this here. I rather take a pragmatic stance which recognizes that the category of religion as a modern Western invention, Lea has referred to that already, has been exported out into the world in the course of Europe's imperial outreach and is made operative in state governance. This also means that it is fruitful to even rethink religion from there, from those areas. And that is a very important project for me. Plurality refers to a social space in which multiple religious and secular others coexist in a particular political order. The regulation of religions and their coexistence by a state occurs differently in, for instance, a theocracy with one state religion and a limited public presence for adherents of other minority traditions, or an indigenous society in which different spirits and cults coexist and compete, or a secular society which may grant in principle the freedom of religious expression, yet culturally privilege one majority religion over others and fail to protect minorities, as we see currently very strongly in India, for example. Think of Hindutva, but we could also come up with a number of Western examples, France, and so on. I prefer the term plurality to pluralism because the latter term has strong normative connotations. Pluralism is usually employed to refer to political projects of regulating religion in society on the basis of a particular blueprint of what religion is supposed to be. In modern secular formations, the privileged blueprint for religion is grounded in Christianity, while other religious traditions, such as Islam, are framed in its image. And I think Assad and Mahmoud have pointed out this very well. The coexistence of adherents to various religious traditions is not to be seen in terms of a homogenized plurality of equivalent parts, but as a historically constituted heterogeneous configuration rife with tensions and power relations. Taking plurality with its focus on the in-between as the default opens up new possibilities for research. Plurality is a broader framework for analysis, I think, than that of interreligious or interfaith encounter. The latter usually takes recognized world religions, often Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism as the starting point, whereas it is difficult to include indigenous religious traditions on equal terms, also because they have long been dismissed as pagan, idolatric, or demonic, and hence to be left behind in favor of Islam or Christianity, as I noticed over and over again in my research in Ghana. And of course, those things discarded as idolatric by missionaries ended up in museums, now raising lots of debates about restitution and what have you. I'm much interested in the ways in which official programs for facilitating interfaith encounters between, for instance, Muslims and Christians are practiced on the ground. Ironically, as pointed out by my colleague Erik Meinema in his research on interreligious dialogue between Muslims, Christians, and Giriama traditionalists on the Swahili coast in Kenya, often dialogue is not adopted in the face-to-face meetings of adherents to these traditions. There is rather a deafening silence about peace building, the very pressing theme that underpins the necessity for such meetings, which is filled by drinking Coca-Cola and light conversations. Such projects, which occur across Africa and are instigated by Christian instances as Prokmura and other NGOs, are an intriguing instance of encounters occurring in the interstices next to other instances. Placing the dynamics of religious coexistence center stage draws attention to all sorts of organized and expected, as well as informal and unexpected ways in which people relate to religious others in a convivial or conflict mode or anything in between, using multiple channels for communication, which include but also exceed dialogue. Here, your interests as organizers who seek to broaden the understanding of interreligious encounters beyond dialogue, and my interest in dynamics of coexistence in plural spaces converge nicely, and I really much look forward to our exchange of views. So, religious groups do not coexist as already bounded entities, but are formed and confirmed through logics of selfing and othering, to invoke my late colleague Gerd Baumann here, in a specific minority-majority configuration and in political regimes of governing difference and managing plurality. The configuration of the field as a whole has implication for its parts and vice versa. Understanding plurality as more than the sum of its parts brings into the picture the interstices in which differences become apparent and are negotiated. Georg Simmel famously suggested in his essay on space and spatial orders that Zwischenräume, interstices, are sites in which different actors relate to each other and hence are the condition for social relations to exist. This being so, the interstice forms a privileged unit for socio-cultural analysis that allows us to explore how relating happens, how fixities and identities occur, are frozen and get unhinged. And we can easily, I think, link up here with work by Homi Bhabha, his notion of the third space, Pratt's contact zone, or Chidesta's frontier zone. But I cannot go into this here, but I really see very strong resonances. Attention for interstices as spaces for encounters that are always in motion saves us from sliding into an essentializing view on religious traditions as bounded blocks, as an idea of world religion would do. As a figure of thought, the interstice moves our inquiries to the level of lived religion, where actors encounter significant others to whom they relate in multiple ways. The point is to avoid an often barely acknowledged methodological religionism. I quote Devaka Premavardhana here, and instead have an eye for the margins of religious traditions and groups where they rub against and overlap with each other, encountering other potentials and possibilities that may be negotiated and rejected, or embraced and adapted. Once the interstice is taken as a prime unit for analysis, a plethora of modalities of coexistence across boundaries become visible. A focus on lived plurality lays bare multiple practices of relating. So far, as noted in your call, scholars have paid much attention to dialogue among proponents of faith, as well as to conversion, be it to Christianity or Islam. Related to the latter is attention paid to the difficulty for new converts to fully renounce their previous indigenous, often spiritual attachments involving charges of backsliding or syncretism. But if one zooms in on a plural religious field as a whole, next to dialogue, understood as an exchange of ideas across religious boundaries for the sake of peace and understanding, and conversion, understood as a shift of religious allegiance from one religion to another, many other so far overlooked practices come to the fore, including copying, translating, exchanging, comparing. And I will offer some examples for this in the third part of this lecture. Importantly, taking plurality as a starting point implies to always consider how the presence of others impinges on the religious groups we study. And so I share Hannah Arendt's view that to live together in the world means essentially that a world of things is between those who have it in common, as a table is located between those who sit around it. The world, like every in-between, relates and separates men at the same time. Important in Arendt's statement is that what is held in common both relates and separates. As much as the table is shared, it also acts as a boundary that divides. And I think the German term Teilen expresses this very well. Next to a table, we can also think, for instance, about a church used by multiple parties, including a Christian congregation, as well as secular organizations in the sphere of art. In her research on the multiple use of monumental city churches in the Netherlands, my colleague Elsa Kuik has spotlighted the boundaries and tensions between the parties involved in the same site. In a site as the Old Church in Amsterdam, Protestant Christians felt that their services were hampered by marked unavoidable presences of artistic installations in the church space. Much more could be said about this example, but my point is that sharing a common world means encountering all sorts of boundaries between others that are marked through things. Such boundaries increase with the diversification of societies, especially in urban metropoles, as we experience also in Europe and the UK. Diversification and the self-contained bubbles created by social media may challenge or ultimately undo the perception of something as being common, yielding incommensurability and distrust of facts between people's life worlds. I understand a common world as an interstice in which people encounter and thus relate to and separate from each other, mediated through things. Any analysis of such encounters has to take things and the ways in which they are apprehended by the senses and make sense from multiple religious and secular angles seriously. And here we have reached the second theme of this lecture, materiality. The so-called material turn in the study of religion took off in the 1990s and became more articulate and broadly shared since the early 2000s. And so just to rehearse, but you referred to this already. But so the proponents of this material turn criticized that the theories and methods employed in the study of religion bore the legacy of idealism and were inflected with a mentalist bias that befitted a bourgeois Protestant post-Enlightenment religiosity and its anti-Catholic polemics. The material turn does not imply a materialist critique that unmasks religion as a mere illusion, as posited by 19th century scientific materialism, but a critique of the study of religion from within that advocates coming to terms with materiality as part of the study of religion, as Dick Hauptmann and I put it some time ago. Materiality is understood as intrinsic to religion. After all, as anthropologist Matthew Engelke put it, quote, all religion is material religion. And yet, as a result of post-Enlightenment legacies, a modern dematerialized understanding of religion emerged. The study of religion occurred from an initially Protestant, subsequently secularized modern mentalistic bias, through which religion was above all understood in terms of private interior belief and doctrines conveyed through texts. Due to being framed along such a Protestant line, in the modern study of religion, the prime issues associated with materiality, sensation, the body, and material stuff, have long played a minor role. This is what the current move to materiality seeks to repress, so as to bring back into view what Peter Bräunlein, in his great overview article, Thinking Religion Through Things, called the other side of religion. Now, what is meant by material and materiality, and which understanding of religion is enabled from that angle? The adjective material has proved to be well suited to get new foci for research. But if it were merely employed as a permanent opposite to mental, the binary into which both terms are trapped would be reproduced, only switching material to the privileged side, and this would be rather dull. The material turn in the study of religion thrives on an initial sense of surprise that, after all, materiality does matter for the study of religion. Taking as a starting point the concrete study of material forms in religious settings, the aim is to unhinge the mental material binary through a critical reflection on the religion and materiality nexus. My aim in this endeavor is to ultimately fold materiality back into a broadened understanding of religion. But for now, the focus on materiality is productive because it generates empirical and conceptual attention to how religion materializes in the world. This yields an understanding of religion as a down-to-earth and practical matter, emphasizing that it is humans who do religion with their bodies and senses, and by being entangled with all sorts of things to evoke a sense of the presence and reality of the divine. Thinking along this materialist line, as noted, does not imply that religion is to be reduced to sheer matter, so that the imaginary that is left after such stripping could be unmasked as a mere illusion. Neither does a material approach to religion reinstate the modern idea of human dominance over matter. As David Morgan explains succinctly in his recent book, The Thing About Religion, which appeared just before COVID, he writes, materiality is not like pliable clay or cookie dough in which we impress our will. It is how the world pushes back against us, needs or shatters our ideas, joins with us to make something bigger or longer lasting than our bodies. Agency does not belong only to human beings, but is shared by all kinds of things. Even the archive is more, I think one could very well think the archive also from this quote. Morgan's plastic phrasing asserts the need to develop a more synthetic and materially grounded understanding of humans and religion in the world that challenges the long-held modernist idea of humans as mastering matter. Inspired by Latour, Morgan suggests an alternative understanding of humans as being embedded in networks or assemblages with human and non-human agents, which involve all sorts of corporeal engagements and practices, at least on the level of the human imagination and experience. This take on religion as a network of all these components is insightful because it calls attention to the concrete material and corporeal forms which are necessary to evoke a sense of the presence of entities such as gods and spirits. Divergent religious phenomena, as the cultic use of relics as harbingers of sacrality, the employment of a charm to summon spiritual forces for the sake of protection, the recitation of the Holy Quran or a biblical passage or a Byzantine icon have something in common. The professed beyond or transcendent is evoked in the immanent with immanent means, as I would say, from the ethic level of the secular scholar who wants to compare religious practices across time and space, and yet is at the same time keen to get as close as possible to people's own historically situated terms and experiences. I hasten to stress that I do not use transcendent in a metaphysical or Christian theological sense, but as a practice of transcending, which is a practice of gesturing from here to there, of moving beyond the ordinary. To grasp the making and operation of material portals that open up to a professed beyond for believers, I coined the concept sensational form. Sensational forms are transmitted and shared ways of doing religion that offer modes and means to experience a sense of extraordinary presence through tuning the senses. The concept of sensational form can be used to analyze all sorts of religious practices, from easily recognizable ritual performances as a church service, a libation to indigenous African spirits, to recurrent domestic acts of worship in front of a statue of Mary or Jesus, or practices of meditation, to the affordances of images and buildings in experiencing the divine. Calling for a focus on such material and sensorial dimensions of religious practice, sensational form thus is intended as a cross-cutting concept that offers a method to explore how the sensations triggered by material forms generate a sense of special spiritual presence that moves beyond the limit of the merely physical, and that is difficult to articulate with words, yet goes under the skin. I initially coined sensational form and the concomitant concept of aesthetic formation, which I understand as a community of sense that is constituted through the circulation and use of a set of sensational forms, to better understand people's allegiance to a particular religious group, striving to move beyond the textual gaze. The challenge for me now is to develop this material and corporeal approach to religion for the sake of a better understanding of plurality. Understood as coexistence of religious and secular others, plurality involves the coexistence of specific sensational forms that characterize a religious tradition and distinguish it from others. To return to Arendt, the world of things that is between those who have it in common is subject to different values and meanings, as things are enveloped in different religious and secular human things assemblages and part of different sensational forms that are as such not easily visible. These differences can be assessed by taking a material approach to interreligious encounters. Encounters often involve conflicts and may yield open clashes, not simply between religious groups, but also very much between secular and religious positions. While the regulation of religion by the state includes the protection of the freedom of worship, this freedom may be up against the freedom of speech, which includes the right to speak out against religion, as well as against state policies in disallowing certain material markers of religious identity in public, as the so-called burqa or the headscarf, and now also the abaya in schools and other state institutions in France. Clashes over religious things, images, buildings, objects abound in our contemporary plural societies, which is the central theme of the Religious Matters project. The sacrality with which certain things become vested within a sensational form is not necessarily recognized and respected by different religious and secular others. An obvious example are conflicts about provocative acts, as the physical burning of a Quran in Copenhagen and Stockholm, where the burning is to actively indicate desecration of what is holy for Muslim believers, or the aggressive attacks on indigenous shrines, which are dismissed as idolatric by Pentecostals in Ghana and elsewhere. But there are also more tacit irritations and lingering feelings of offense, as occurs, for instance, in the recycling of discarded Catholic materials, Catholicism being a very material religion. So in a way, unchurching has a very strong material dimension, right? So, and artists, of course, take up these kind of, what has become sacred waste, as Irene Stengs might call it, and make something out of it, which may be found transgressive by current and former believers who will not be happy to see discarded once sacred forms as safely kept now in the category of secular art or heritage. The point here is that religious things are vested with values and meanings and raise certain sensibilities that are often difficult to put into words, let alone to discuss in a dialogue. Their perceived desecration triggers strong affective responses. People feeling at least potentially offended may respond strongly and even use violence, but may also deploy what Brian Larkin in his work on northern Nigeria calls techniques of inattention, so as to be not receptible to any potential offense from religious others and withdraw into their own circle. How to get a scholarly understanding of the sensitivities and sensibilities that arise from clashes over divergent stances towards religious things in plural settings is a huge concern for current research. The concept of sensational form is helpful, in my view, to analyze clashes in which the sacrality attributed to a thing by one group, yet not recognized by others, is at stake. But of course, there is more to encounters between religious and secular others than clashes and conflicts over sacralized and thus potentially desecrated forms. While sensational forms are at the core of a religious tradition in that they create a connection between humans and the spiritual or transcendent or divine, which is a sine qua non for religion, I would say, encounters between religious others involve more than clashes, bridges, gaps, and overlaps between sensational forms. And this more can best come into focus by a detailed exploration of interreligious relations undertaken from a material and corporeal angle on the ground. And this will occupy us in the third and last part of this lecture, which I titled Materiality as a Lens into the Dynamics of Plural Settings. And in this part, I want to call attention to the outcomes of a long-standing collaboration of junior and senior scholars in Ghana and the Netherlands. Together with my colleague Samuel Tevusu, I could launch this collaboration as an explicit study of modalities of coexistence in the religiously and ethnically plural neighborhood of Medina in Ghana's capital, Accra. Located on Ga traditional land, Medina got urbanized with the influx of northern Muslims who were resettled in the area in the late 1950s and grew exponentially with the implementation of structural adjustment policies in the 1980s that prompted people to leave rural areas. Today, Medina has about 140,000 inhabitants. It is an area in which Muslims, who form the majority of its population in the otherwise strongly Pentecostalized south of Ghana, Christians and traditionalists negotiate their relations with their religious and ethnic others. As a cosmopolitan place par excellence, new goods, images, and ideas from all over the world touch ground in Medina and are appropriated by its inhabitants into new styles. While they publicly express their religious identities in a marked, material and bodily manner, they deploy a pragmatics of coexistence. As a shared space, Medina is a world in which urban religiosities are developed and deployed, yet also reach their limits, as no religious tradition can impose a closed imaginary on Medina as a whole. Involving multiple dimensions, political, religious, aesthetic, moral, sensorial, the relations between Muslims and Christians and traditionalists may range from contestation and conflict to indifference to cordial conviviality. As a team, we have studied the modalities of coexistence that shape how people relate to each other in the same habitat from grounded material, corporeal, and gender angles. The methodological and conceptual anchor point is the interstice in which connections and relations are shaped by Medina's diverse inhabitants. And here I want to highlight a set of modalities of coexistence that exist in the shadow of loud and explicit projects on interreligious encounter. They become apparent thanks to an explicit focus on material forms which connect and separate, and thus are common to people with different religious affiliations. So we look at uses of space, negotiations of food, beauty practices, and the pursuit of health. And this work is done by 4 PhD students working from Medina. Sharing a common world, Medina's inhabitants tend to eschew huge conflicts, even though there is much potential for clashes, and they do sometimes occur. In fact, as reported by my senior colleague, religious studies scholar Rabiatu Amar, in Medina there is a saying, fitna, trouble, is asleep until you wake it up. To not wake trouble up by staying cool, seems to be an important part of an everyday ethics. Let me start with uses of space. Joseph Fosu Ankra, for instance, studied the opening of a new market by the government, which had hitherto been a space seen as highly immoral, hosting sex workers, drug dealers, and their clients. The opening involved the planting of a shrine for an indigenous Ga deity on the market premises. While both Muslims and Christians take distance from traditional religion, and Pentecostal and Sunni groups actively take a stance against idolatry or shirk and seek to purify Christian and Islamic practices from remnants of traditional belief, the planting of the deity in the shrine was not hampered by them. Even staunch believers negotiate how to deal with traditional religion in their daily practices, trying to stay aloof and not taking part in the regular rituals occurring there. Fosu Ankra very aptly calls this stance unfriendly tolerance. For indeed, it is not necessary to like what one decides to still tolerate. Another intriguing common material form is food and its use in religious and mundane settings. Rashida Al-Hassan Adum Atta reports that Muslims and Christians who attend traditional festivals to pay respect to the traditional Ga authorities on whose land Medina is located, may refrain from taking part in the consumption of alcohol that unavoidably goes with such festival, but attend them at the same time. The point here is to draw a boundary with regard to their degree of participation in a traditional ceremony. Rather than going for full immersion, people stay by the side, even though they find that their religion forbids the use of alcohol, and perhaps even being in its presence. And here we see from Adum Atta's dissertation in progress also a picture of a Ga chief paying homage to a Ga ancestors with a non-alcoholic drink, because he had converted to Islam. So it also happens on that level of those offering sacrifice. You won't annoy a spirit with offering him or her alcohol, whereas she does not like that. Similarly, also people, staunch Christians who don't drink alcohol, or Muslims, they may visit restaurants and bars where alcohol is for sale and which are therefore haram, yet they decide to refrain from consumption of it. There is a strong awareness that the strict religious interdictions with regard to the use of alcohol cannot be imposed on Medina as a whole, and in order to continue their whereabouts with others, people negotiate the presence of alcohol on the level of their own behavior. While this stance is perceived as workable with regard to alcohol, matters become much more complicated in the case of pork, which is a no-go for Muslims and to be avoided so as to issue pollution. Adum Atta has conducted research on a section of the Medina market where imported pig feet, trotter from Europe, from the Netherlands, also from the UK, Germany, and so on, are sold in large masses. The more pig we eat, and the less feet we are interested to eat in Europe, the more goes down there and to China and Vietnam. And this is a predominantly Muslim market, and she learned that Muslim customers try to stay aloof from this part for fear of being polluted. They have strong feelings of disgust facing the sight and smell of trotter. Conversely, trotter sellers, knowing that pork is taboo for Muslims, have a very strong sense that people recognizable as Muslims are not expected to buy from them. So when Adum Atta, and you see her here on the picture, right? Sought to buy pork from one of the sellers for the sake of her research, the latter was shocked about the request, and she said, "Hey, this is not for you. This is not for Muslims." Traders of pork who share a compound house with other Muslim inhabitants are excluded from social events such as joint cooking and feasting. People know exactly where it is possible to determine what happens in a space and make others present align with their prerogatives, and where this is not the case, or only to some degree. Day in, day out, they move across spaces in which religious others are also present and develop a pragmatic stance, which involves a self-imposition of a virtual shield for the self in contexts which are perceived as potentially dangerous. Christians often talk about a hedge, the hedge or which people put around them so as to be not polluted or disturbed whilst moving through a certain place. In context as the shared space of a compound house, it is possible to isolate others whose professional work is found polluting, as is the case with trotter sellers. Another intriguing aspect concerns food offerings during high religious festivals, such as Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, Christmas and Easter. As all meat butchered in Medina is slaughtered by Muslims, the issue of halal has not come up until very recently. Formerly, Muslims and Christians would exchange meals during these festivals. With increasing concerns about the halalness of food, which are due to stronger exposure of Medina's Muslims to Islamic movements in the Middle East on the one hand, and fears of especially Pentecostal Christians of being spiritually affected by consuming food from religious others, cooked meals have been replaced by mere ingredients or even money. This indicates that the influence of transnational Pentecostal and Sunni movements, which strive to purify Christianity and Islam from accommodation to the world, which are found unauthentic, has an impact on the exchange of gifts among Muslims and Christians, emphasizing more distance. While all examples presented so far deal with issues whether and how to relate to the practices and things held dear by religious others, we also found practices of accommodating things from the other. This comes to the fore clearly in the research by Kauthar Kamis on female beauty practices. In their struggle to remain beautiful in an aesthetic, ethical, and erotic sense, Muslim and Christian women share the spaces of beauty salons and offer each other advice. Kamis documents how Muslim brides negotiate conservative prerogatives communicated to them by imams and elderly people in a way that some innovation and pushing boundaries ahead occurs without falling out of the scope of acceptable behavior. Very interesting is also that some Christian women started to adopt Muslim dress styles, such as the hijab, and in COVID times also niqab, arguing that in these clothes they feel better protected at night or against the virus. So here a dress style which is markedly associated with Islamic piety, and for that matter hotly debated in Ghanaian society, which is majority Christian, as I indicated. So here such a dress style is taken as a mundane piece of cloth with a clear protective function. A religious form becomes adopted by being secularized, we could say, so to speak. This also shows that religious identities are not necessarily always put up front in engagement with others. Communalities with regard to gender, ethnicity, and profession also are in place. Lastly, Martin Luther Darko investigates how Muslim staff and patients relate to the Christian regime in Medina's Pentecost Hospital, which is the only high-profile medical facility in the area. And unfortunately, I did not have my pictures of that hospital on my laptop. I could only make the PowerPoint this morning, so I had to find something from the net. As health seeking is the primary concern of the patients, many of whom are pregnant Muslim women in need of medical care, they accommodate to the mandatory morning devotion, which all patients are expected to follow, with some actively listening and praying along, and others just sitting there and sleeping a bit. DACO shows that a sense of necessity, darura, overrules the requirements of Islamic piety, which for many patients is binding in their everyday life. And in addition, there is a general idea in Medina that people cannot pray enough, whether to the Christian God or to Allah, who may be the same anyhow. This also shows in everyday encounters on Medina's crowded pavements, where preachers stand to preach day in, day out, and ask for offerings. Much more could be said about this research project, but I hope I have been able to convey my point that a detailed study of relations and exchanges across religious boundaries offers insights into all kinds of small yet effective and sustained practices of coexisting beyond dialogue, for sure. And this is, in my view, a good example of the purchase of studying interreligious encounters from a material and corporeal angle. In the conference outline, you asked, how do material elements, from buildings to food to bodies, enable interreligious relations, shape the texture of those relations, and facilitate respect and care? I think that the example of Medina, understood as an interstice with coexisting religious others, helps answer this question. The texture of everyday life in a multi-religious space as Medina is made up of myriad small exchanges that seek to keep fitna asleep as much as possible. While this engagement, we could say in pianissimo, on a local level in an interstice, does not undo the importance of interfaith dialogue, I think that it serves as a reminder that relations between proponents of religious traditions amount to much more than being maintained and sorted out by mere talking. Thank you for your attention.
I think we have time for maybe exactly one or two questions, if that's okay. Yeah, we can open it up for maybe just one or two.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk. Also, it's really, as the Cambridge Interfaith program, that kind of gave all of us a good, lots of thoughts about how we can, lead the future research. As I was listening to your talk, I was thinking, is there anything else we can liken the phenomena that religion comes in plurality? So then it has to be right about the way culture works, the way language works, so it cannot be only about religion. So my mind was going to language. I guess language also always have to come in plurality, but at the same time, language works a little bit different from religion. Yeah, have you ever thought like that? Is anything else?
Oh yeah. And I think when you can just turn to Cambridge and Marilyn Sturturn and the notion of multiplicity, relationality, I think in the anthropology department, this approach, of course, has been worked out to a great extent. For me, as a scholar, having in a way somehow really sucked into the study of religion, it has been very important to make this point with regard to religion, also because often differences between religions are so much emphasized, so much so that even intuitively one would go for that. And I think it's very important to see that, yes, religious boundaries are being made, but they have to be made and they can be undone and negotiated. But I would say more in general, I think that relationality and multiplicity or plurality, I'm always in between terms here. I came down to think of plurality as perhaps a bit more suiting my concerns here. Is a very good starting point for anything. Yeah.
I was just going to add to what Edward was saying. In linguistic anthropology, there's a very similar movement. It's not thinking about languages as having discrete boundaries, but actually looking, the term is used, it used to be code switching, and now there's a move to languaging or translanguaging. So, and I was listening to your talk, which was fascinating. It really reminded me of a lot of the kind of debates in linguistic anthropology. Yes.
Interesting, and we had some examples of this also, I think, this morning when we looked at the documents,
Exactly,
right?
that's
Yeah.
a perfect example.
Yes,
of
yes,
that.
and code switching is too limited.
Right, it
yeah.
assumes the coherence
Exactly,
of the code.
it's a bit like syncretism or something.
Right, and in
Yeah,
some cases that might be
Yeah.
very like parts of Europe,
Yeah.
but in most places it's
yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. Oh, yeah.
Just one last question, if I may. Thank you. I very much enjoyed also the presentation of your case studies. What I was thinking is, in addition to the language aspect, whether you looked also into trade relations or consumerism as an effect to all of the elements you presented.
Yeah, I think trade is what happens in Medina, what keeps the Medina going. So it means that indeed people trade with each other, from each other, and also channel all kinds of items that come from the Middle East, that come from Nigeria, from Europe, the US. They channel it in a way into people's households and so on. And then in these contexts, religion does play a role, for they have to know how to trade what between. Dr. Kamis does a very interesting research on kayamata, which are kind of aphrodisiacs for women, and so she looks into the trade of these kinds of items and how Muslim and Christian female customers are into it to fool their husbands a bit and all that, or also Rashida Al-Hassan Adumata was this. She also visited a factory where pork is procured in the process in the Netherlands, and followed in a way the trotter down to Ghana and how they are traded there. Yeah, I think that trade is a very important kind of social economic activity that goes very much with this idea of people are also into multiplicity, and they sell and buy things they don't have but they need. So it's of course about exchange and so on. So it would go into the same direction. I think trade is a very important insight. I think it fuels and underpins these kinds of exchanges and this coexistence. Yeah.
Well, I think just in the interest of keeping to the schedule, this sounds like a good place to take a really quick break, but I think this has given us an absolutely wonderful place to start the discussion, given us a lot to think about for sure, and I think really set us up to dive into some of the papers that will be coming up. So thank you again so much.
My pleasure.
Dr. Badder.